Welcome to Serge's webinar called Towards a Resilient Calling. If you'll bear with us, we're going to give folks a few moments to sign in. And while you're joining us, I invite you to find the Q&A function in your toolbar. Matt will spend a significant portion of our time together today fielding questions. So throughout his content presentation, please feel free to go ahead and submit your questions. There's also an option to submit those anonymously if you'd like. If you are just joining us now, welcome to our webinar on calling. This is a Serge webinar focused particularly towards the new generations and those who lead them. If you're new to Serge, we are a Christ-centered, grace-based missions agency that brings together spiritual growth and mission. And the way we do that is through sending missionaries across the globe and also producing Christ-centered resources along with mentoring ministry leaders. My name is Lindsay Kimball, and I work here on Serge's renewal team. At Serge, the reason we place an emphasis on gospel renewal is because we believe that as we're renewed in the gospel, we are compelled out onto mission in the lives of others. And in essence, renewal in the gospel really is what impacts calling. We're going to be talking about a few different resources today, and I just want to give you a heads up on a few of them. Mentored Sonship is really a mentoring program for missionaries and ministry leaders to help them think about how their own renewal drives them into mission in the lives of others. Discipler Training is an online course that might be helpful to you as you think about leading the next generation. Don't worry about copying these down. We'll mention them again towards the end. And while we're talking about calling in a more general sense today, I also want to just mention two Serge programs that Matt will mention in his presentation. These two programs are great for people who are exploring their calling. Our internships are 8-week summer programs that take place on all of our fields, and our apprenticeships also take place on a variety of our fields globally, and those are 12 to 24 months. Both of these programs serve to really bring together what God is doing in your heart with hands-on mission work and personal mentoring from experienced missionaries. In both of these programs, participants get to learn about cross-cultural mission work with a local ministry team, and are mentored at the same time in sonship and other gospel-centered teaching. We'll come back to both of these towards the end of the webinar and include links to more info about both of these programs. Just a few housekeeping items. If you are signing on now, there's a Q&A function in the Zoom toolbar on your screen, and you can use that to submit questions at any point today. Towards the end of the webinar, Matt will spend a significant amount of time fielding those questions, so please ask away. We won't be using the raise hand or the chat functions today. So now I'm excited to introduce you to Matt Allison, who is our speaker for today's webinar. Matt served in Uganda with Serge just after college and then pursued graduate studies. He came back to Serge in 2012, leading Serge's mobilization effort to field missionaries all over the world. Last year, he moved into the role of Human Development Director, which really means that he is shepherding individuals in finding and flourishing in their callings. Matt has really great insights into the needs, values, and struggles of today's younger generation, and he and his wife have one son, Clark, and live in Philadelphia. We had originally intended for Leah Emery, who leads one of our apprenticeship programs, to join us today, but because of some unforeseen circumstances, she wasn't able to, so we're sorry about that. But Matt, we are so glad you're here, and I will turn things over to you now.
Thanks, Lindsay. It's great to be here. It's great to talk about this really important topic. I myself am a millennial, so from the generation of folks that were born between the early 80s and the mid 90s. I'll talk a little bit about millennials today, but really my focus is on that next generation that comes after millennials, folks who are born in the mid 90s and up through the 2000s, who are really coming into adulthood today in 2018 through going to college and entering into the workforce. So just to distinguish a little bit between these two generations, I realize that for many of us, millennials has kind of become a grab bag idea for us. For anyone who's sort of under 40, And I really want to take a minute to distinguish between these two generations, because I think it's helpful for us to understand some of the challenges around resilience and calling that I want to talk about today. So millennials, again, folks born in between the early 80s and mid 90s. Depending on which research group you look at, there's a little bit of fluidity in the dates, but say for now, 1980 to 1990, millennials like myself are passionate, they're individualistic, and idealistic. At times, we can seem somewhat entitled. Our commitment to chasing our passions can sometimes make us seem entitled and inconsistent or unreliable. There's a lot of head shaking that happens around millennials. And it tends to be when we do things like say, yeah, we're going to do this thing, but then actually we don't. We decide to do something else instead. We came into our adolescence as millennials with the consumer internet really being in the middle of things. And then we entered college in a time in which the most people ever in American history were going to college. Things were very competitive in terms of admissions. But then on the other side of college, as we entered the workforce, we did that right before, during, or after the Great Recession. And so that has really shaped who we are. But today I want to talk about that next generation, the smartphone generation. Some people call them the iGen. The smartphone generation is just coming into adulthood. Whereas I'm 35, the millennials, we've been around for a while. You've been bumping up against us if you're not from that generation for a decade or longer. The smartphone generation was born after 1995. They came into adolescence beginning in 2007 when the iPhone was introduced as a consumer product. Their young adulthood, adolescence, and today has really been shaped profoundly by personal connectivity to the internet, and the internet through the smartphone as the central mediation device for how they do life. They're less likely to have worked before going to college in a part-time job than any generation before. They probably didn't get a driver's license unless they were living in a fairly rural or exurban area before going into college. And they entered college almost crippled by an awareness of how expensive it was, how likely they were to have to take on extensive debt to go through college. And they're just now entering the workforce. So I haven't seen great data on distinguishing them from millennials as workers. But just to parse the two generations a little bit for you, and I'm going to talk a lot more about the smartphone generation's distinctives in a minute. But let me just also say that when we're talking about generations and sort of their defining characteristics, I fully recognize that individual experience and even the subculture that we belong to at times has far more influence over who we are as people than these broad generational tendencies. But the broad general tendencies are there. And so I want to take those seriously. So I just want to give you guys a little bit of a problem as I've encountered it. Every year, part of my job is I review 40 to 80 summer internship applications. These are folks who are predominantly in college, so 18 to 22 or 23 years old, from across the church. They are generally evangelical. They are attracted somewhat to Serge and our ethos, and they feel a sense of calling to some extent towards missions. So we see 40 to 80 of these people every year fill out an application, and in that application, they provide a personal page where they talk about sort of, different personal struggles or history that they have. And in this smartphone generation, it's really since 2012, what I've begun to see is that sexual promiscuity for this group, meaning them disclosing, a sexual history with a boyfriend or, any kind of, sexual promiscuity, that's down, way, way down. What's also way, way down is young women who are disclosing any kind of history of eating disorders. When you looked at my generation in the mid-2000s doing these same kinds of applications, many, a double-digit percentage, somewhere between 25 and 50% of the women who would apply for a summer internship with Serge would say, yes, I have a history of eating disorders. Eating disorders have virtually disappeared in our applicant population. But so, in general, those are good things, I would say. Sexual promiscuity being down and eating disorders being down. But on the same time, some other not so great things are happening. We're seeing a significant increase in women and men disclosing anxiety, depression, and self-harm. Similarly, we're seeing an increase in women disclosing pornography addiction. Men, it's been relatively a high percentage and relatively flat, but we're seeing more and more women acknowledge that as well. So there's some real clear distinctives here, I think, in the smartphone generation, or the iGen, in how they're changing from the millennials. And it's easy. I'm not an expert in, young adult psychology or teen development, but it's really easy for me to see some clear implications here of what this might mean. And then when we look at the national context, I think, a lot of things that we see in these internship applications is really backed up. Just a few statistics for you to consider. In the smartphone generation, the rate of hospitalization for suicidal ideation has doubled in the last 5 years, since 2012. And the number of teens who say, yes, I socialize with my friends on a daily basis, that number has halved. And the number of the smartphone generation who have gone on a date is only about half, which, if you looked at my generation, it was about 85% of my generation had gone out on dates by the time of their high school graduation. Only about half say they have. And on average, millennials, they're having sex, the smartphone generation, a year later than millennials. So, again, these are some really interesting trends, some major changes. Just to reiterate where I'm getting some of this information, I think Jean Twenge wrote a great article that's pretty in-depth in the Atlantic Monthly called "Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation?" She's a psychologist, an academic at UC San Diego. She's done a lot of study of millennials, my generation, as well as this emergent generation, the smartphone generation. And so I think, she has written books too, but if you really just want to dive in quickly, that Atlantic Monthly article that you see there, "Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation?" is really helpful. And again, these trends, this, less experience, whether good or bad, this greater level of anxiety, this greater level of suicidal ideation. I don't mean to sound like a grump in describing them or contrasting the smartphone generation negatively somehow to the millennial generation or other generations. But I think that there are some real consequences to these generational trends that I want to just highlight for us. The smartphone generation, I think, is developmentally delayed from any generation prior. Twenge talks about it in these terms, where Generation X became adults in their and by the time they finished college, they were really adults. Millennials sort of became adults sometime in their 20s. Twenge says, we need to think about the smartphone generation as still being children, let alone adults. They're children going into high school. And so there's a developmental delay, socially and emotionally, that is happening in this generation. Twenge thinks puts a lot of, obviously from the article title, a lot of power on the smartphone and creating that delay. I don't know personally if that's why, but it definitely seems to be a clear trend. And I think that isolation that they talk about, that not socializing with friends on a regular basis, that not being in romantic relationships as frequently, that anxiety and just kind of fear, these things are really leaving them ill-equipped to live as Christ to others. I think you have to have a strong sense of self in order to live sacrificially for the other. And so I think that what this ultimately amounts to is that, when you look at this generation, they are less equipped than you might expect to really lean into a sense of calling into mission. They may have heard a sermon, they may have watched a compelling YouTube video about the unreached, they may have seen or experienced something that makes them think that missions or leaning into the mission of Christ in some way is an important thing to do. But in this macro level, they're less likely than ever to really be equipped to lean into that calling that they're feeling. This can work out in lots. Just to give you a couple examples of how this can work out in really mundane ways. I think that if you've never worked a job and you're going as an 18 or 19-year-old into a summer internship with an organization like Serge, never having worked a job is a serious impediment to working really hard for 2 months in a new and challenging environment of another country and working alongside a team of missionaries in some capacity. So all these sorts of, experiential delays that we just talked about are hard. I talked to another peer in another missions agency, and he told me a story of a couple summers ago with this generation. A team welcomed a summer internship group to a European city, and a big part of the outreach that summer was going to be this group of 18 to 22-year-old smartphone gen kids doing street evangelism, which is a daunting thing for any of us. None of us relish, or very few of us, I should say, relish the idea of just jumping into conversation with a stranger about who Jesus is. But that's what they were signing up for this summer. And then but when they actually got there and the rubber met the road, as a group, all like 6 of these interns decided they would rather just go home than participate. The reality of leaning into the sense of calling to, reach this European city, they just weren't able to boot up on it. And so they went home. At this point, I was going to ask Leah to talk a little bit more about her own experience working with this generation. And so because of some issues with our team in London, she's not able to participate. But I think what she would say is that what she sees as a major impediment is largely having the basic skills to follow through on the vision. We all know what it's like to idealize something, to have a stirring vision for doing a thing. And what she's experiencing in her context in London, leading folks who come for a summer or for a year from this generation, is they are surprising her with how few skills and abilities they have in comparison to like the millennial generation or other generations to enact this sense of passion or sense of calling. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the barriers that I see in resilience to this generation's calling. One, I've already kind of highlighted a lot: the lack of life experience. I think another is the isolation has deprived a lot of the smartphone generation of an experience of strong community that they can pull from as they lean into doing something more missionally, both as a support, but also as experience that they can then put into practice in a new context. And I think, there's this kind of cultural idea of autonomy that is really strong. That's something that we've had for multiple generations. But I think more than ever, we've placed the onus on the individual to really determine all things for themselves. And, if you have followed Christ for any time at all, I hope that you'll have learned that following Christ means dying to your sense of self, and embracing this new sense of self and giving up your sense of autonomy, and at times in really hard ways. And so I think there's this, these three things are a big problem. But then I think there's an additional problem, which is the language that we've tended to use around calling. I think this is disconnected a little bit from the reality of the smartphone generation. I think a great book for the boomer generation, and even a book that I've benefited some myself as a millennial to think about calling, is John Eldridge's Wild at Heart. And a huge piece of his language around calling is passion. It's that you find your calling to some extent in Christ when you really help yourself by exploring what are you passionate about, what makes you feel alive. And I think that that worked really well, like when I went to Urbana in 2006. When we were focused on millennials, that sense of passion was something that really resonated. But I think in the smartphone generation, there are more and more folks who are just deeply unsure about what they're passionate about. So passion doesn't get to discernment, which is a significant barrier, I think. So I want to talk then about, a little bit about how do we, if we can't use life experience, if we can't use, passion and passion language, how do we help this generation have a resilient sense of calling? What does it look like? There's a couple big picture ideas that I'll unpack for us. Push into a richer life with others, push the smartphone generation into a richer life with others, process the pain of the past, and then propose how processed pain can lead to passion, to new passion in life. So I don't want to give up on passion entirely. I just want the source of passion to be our pain for this generation. So push into richer life with others. What do I mean by that? I think whether you are working with youth in your youth group in some church here in the US, or whether you're doing college ministry, or whether you're working on the field with us right now with Serge or with some other agency, and you're doing stuff with this generation, you can readily recognize that there is a very clear hesitation and or inability to reach out to the other person. And again, there's plenty of exceptions to this. There's plenty of folks in the smartphone generation who are great connectors, who are great at pushing into richer life with others already. But you'll find, I think that you're going to find more and more, if you haven't yet, kids or young adults who don't know how to do this, or are afraid to do this, or have never had this modeled to them. So push into richer life with others. A couple, I think, concrete ways you can think about doing this. One would be, getting rid of smartphones in certain ministry settings. For our summer interns, we don't like confiscate them when they get on an airplane because they're pretty essential devices in this day and age. But we don't allow them to get SIM cards in most of our fields, so they don't have easy access to the internet all the time like they're used to. And we try to find ways to remove the smartphone as the central mediating device for their experience of their summer internship. And I think that can really translate well into work in a college setting, work in a youth group setting, is doing the awkward thing of policing that a little bit. Because remember, I think, and it's important to be respectful and give dignity in this, but I think it's a good rule of thumb to assume that developmentally the people you're working with are less emotionally and socially developed than you would expect based on their appearance. That's something that this research that I've been talking about definitely suggests. I think The good news, though, and as we try to create space to get people to connect with each other in richer ways, there is a deeply felt need. When the smartphone generation is at home on their phones, Snapchatting each other, or looking at other people's posts on Instagram or Facebook or whatever social media, they are hungering for something richer. They're just struggling with the cultural moment they're in that doesn't provide it. So I think that on the other side of the awkward work of creating the space for a richer life, there will be, as just creatures made in the image of Christ, as part of a triune Godhead, there is this hunger for a richer life with others. And so I think that if we as folks working with generation can kind of create space for it and push people into it, it works really great. One of the things that Leah does that I think is excellent in London is when our folks get there, before they do anything else, she has our interns work together on sonship as a curriculum. It's a intensive, just sort of push you into rich dialogue with each other kind of experience. And I think that is excellent. Process pain of the past. What do I mean by that? So we live in a cultural moment where I think victimhood is a very easy way to understand any sort of past suffering. What I mean by that is all of my past suffering defines me somehow as a victim of some other person's evil or aggression or injustice in my own life. And for many people, there are profound stories where they were victimized by evil, perpetuated by others in their life. But I think that we really need to help this generation process their pain in a different way than victimhood. We need to help them process their pain to see how their pain fits within the larger story of creation, fall, redemption, the larger story of sin and brokenness in this world, leading to new life in Christ. And I think a really great diagnostic question when I talk with this group is, how does that pain that you just talked to me about, whether it's the pain of being rejected socially or being abused sexually or being caught in a cycle of loneliness and pornography, how does that pain uniquely enable you to move towards other people with empathy? What is the way that you can love others uniquely because of the pain that you have experienced? And how does that empathy free you up to be self-sacrificial and to love with abandon? And so I think to sort of wrap this slide up, I think that is sort of hopefully where a resilient calling can be found in the smartphone generation. As we from other generations walk alongside these folks, help them push into a richer life with others, help them process the pain of the past, we can propose a new story for how the pain that they've experienced can lead to a passion for living life a certain way. An old book that has been around a little while, Dan Allender's Truth Be Told, I think is great for fleshing out some of what I'm talking about here. I think that anything that the Allender School has done along these lines has been really helpful in my own thinking of how to help this group. With the time I have left, I want to give a little illustration to sort of help see kind of what I'm talking about, a particular story of a particular notional smartphone generation member. I want to talk about Joseph as if he was part of the smartphone generation. I hope that, this sort of sweep of his story can help concretize some of what I'm talking about for you. The illustration of Joseph I like because, in the first part of the Joseph story in Genesis 37, Joseph kind of, he participates in life with his family to some extent in the story, but he also seems kind of set apart and isolated, like the smartphone generation. He's, he gets that special robe from his dad, who, we read loves him and cherishes him more than his older brothers who are from these other wives. And you get the sense that even though Joseph spends time with his brothers, he also has been isolated from them in times. Or at least that's a reasonable thing to imagine based on how free he is with just sharing these sort of offensive dreams with them. You can think about, he not only once but twice shares these offensive dreams with his family where he's like, I'm going to be better than all of you someday. And so I like to imagine Joseph as like sort of your typical smartphone generation person, where he's not been socialized enough by a point that he's at that point in his life as an adolescent to realize that that's not something you should be saying to your older brothers or to your dad. And so then we kind of know what happens to Joseph, right? He has been, he's been sort of arrogant, favored, isolated, sheltered. And his brothers turn on him, plot to kill him, but then decide to instead kill him, just sell him into slavery. So he goes into slavery, and with Potiphar and his wife, has sort of a rise and fall, an ascent, and then a tragedy, where he ends up in jail. And so I really want to focus us in on Genesis 41 to 23, where Joseph has gotten to a point, it's kind of off screen, but he's gotten to a point where he has processed his pain of betrayal, of disappointment, of being treated unjustly in such a way that he can help these two officials from Pharaoh's household process their pain and see dreams not as this thing that disappoints and leads to being cursed, but to see these dreams as blessings from God that he helps these men understand their life. And then I really love kind of the way Joseph concludes as a story when we think about this resilience question, that Joseph gets to the point where he's able to see by the end in Genesis 45, when his brothers and Benjamin kind of come for the sort of food to sustain their family during this time of famine. Joseph is able to just say this beautiful line about, all of my story has enabled this moment to happen, where I am able to proclaim with my life God's love for his people through all of this, and how I'm uniquely able to care for you in this time of need. And it's just a beautiful moment. I think I just love what Dan Allender says about this moment. He says, the hand of God brings goodness you could never have imagined. That promise, as I've said, does not take away suffering, does not take away the reality of death, but it does open our heart to be able to say, death does not get the final word. I think about the smartphone generation as a generation that is in its early stages kind of resigning themselves to death. The isolation, the depression and the anxiety, these generational traits to me are about having this very defeated attitude towards the power of death. And I love the idea of us walking alongside this generation and saying, death does not get the final word. The deaths that you've lived, the pain that you've lived, actually can be a vehicle to share God's goodness with yourself and with the world. Let's get there. Thanks so much for listening. I want to just reiterate a couple things. Our internships and apprenticeships have been around for a while. I think they were formed initially with Gen X in mind, and we transitioned from Gen X into the millennial generation with them, and they've been flourishing. And, we're in the space right now of figuring out how do we make these programs work well for this next generation, the smartphone generation. That's our focus right now. We haven't figured it all out yet, but I have seen beautiful things happen. Last summer, for example, in Ireland, our Ireland internship group, they were a group that was entirely smartphone generation. There were no interns who were kind of a little bit older from that millennial generation that would be at this point like late 20s to early 30s, all smartphone gen. And they were, when I was kind of going into the summer, I was worried like they didn't know how to really engage socially in a way that I was observing. They didn't seem to have an incredible amount of self-awareness about their own story. There were lots of pieces where I was just like, this could be a really awful summer for our folks in Ireland. If any of you guys are here, by the way, I'm sorry if I'm talking bad about you. But the beautiful thing was, when pushed into community with each other through the summer internship, it was beautiful to see this group of 8, I think it was, college students live as Christ to one another in an incredibly rich way. There was a profound hunger for rich life together that I can only think, we've already seen some of these folks come back to Serge to be apprentices. I can only think that that experience of doing that rich life together has built the kinds of experiences that they will, where they did have to process pain through sonship and these other things, that will continue to translate into future resilience. So thanks so much for your time, guys. I think at this point, Lindsay is going to start feeding me some questions, and I'll do my best to answer. I'm not an expert, but I'd love to discuss.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. That was so helpful. And we already have quite a few questions coming in. I invite you to keep asking them, so you can submit them anonymously if you want to. And I'll just be picking questions that feel representative of what Matt just spoke about. So, Matt, here's your first question.
Okay.
Pushing young people to engage with others in a way that is beyond their natural, comfortable tendency is exhausting.
Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for how we can continually give grace through the sometimes long process of growth? Thinking especially of places where workers are needed urgently and the time-consuming work of coaching is tough.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that would be a great one where I wish I had Leah with me, because, Leah is someone who, this is her, life day in, day out. I mean, I know for me, I spend a few intense days with this group a couple times a year. And, I think that for me, where I have to start usually is finding ways in which I can emotionally connect my story to their story. So, when I talk about being a summer intern with this group as they're about to start their internship for the first time, I talk about, there have been times in my life where I have thought that until I can, get all my ducks in a row, like never struggle with lust and pornography, or never struggle with procrastination, or never struggle with feeling like I don't belong. Until I can get all those ducks in my row, I don't feel like I can go into mission. That's a real struggle for me. And so putting myself out there in such a way that I'm building a sense of connection with these folks, and trying to talk about my own story in such a way that they can see things in me. That builds the kind of credibility that they want to be closer to me, and in turn, I want to be closer to them. I think if you start from the posture of just pushing, I probably should have made a fourth point on that slide. If you start with pushing before anything else, I do think it's only exhausting, and it's only gonna, at least if you're like me, it's only gonna lead to a certain amount of cynicism of like, I don't have time for you people. So yeah, great question.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Here's another one. This person says, it is not surprising to hear that this generation has challenges to conventional missions, like the street evangelism that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Is it possible that they also bring a set of skills to reach those in their own generation? And how might missions look different when the workers have a different set of skills, assuming that there are good giftings as well as challenges for this generation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think that there's a more universal language for connection through social media than past generations. So, one thing that we're definitely seeing is, our summer interns, when they go to a place like Ireland, for example, there's ways in which they relate to Irish peers more quickly and sometimes in a very lasting way through these same things that we talk about having negative consequences, like spending a lot of time on your smartphones. So there's an appetite for connection with folks across the ocean that does translate well from being like, I spend every night at my house alone Snapchatting with my friends. Like they can also spend time alone Snapchatting with some Irish kids they met. And so, I do think that is a positive for sure. I think that there's also I think that we're also seeing the smartphone generation, and I may be totally wrong here, but I think that the smartphone generation may have fewer of the stereotypical ugly American characteristics that earlier generations had. The sort of loud, presumptuous, aggressive American cultural markers that can be a huge turnoff in a lot of contexts globally. And so I think that could be a really strong positive. And then finally, I think that if this generation does find calling through processing pain, the reality is pain is not something that American teenagers have a corner on. And I think that there are a lot of places in the world where helping people process their pain and seeing God's goodness in it is probably more compelling than the old passion-driven find your life through what brings you joy kind of paradigm. If you think about just the sweep of human suffering across the world. So those would be three things that this would come to mind.
Yeah, that's great. A couple practical questions that kind of dovetail on each other. One person asked, how did you make the transition from Gen X with your internships? What things did you change? And along a similar vein, how has Serge's mobilization strategy, so recruiting new workers for the field, how has that changed to call younger people to a resilient calling?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I would say that when in transitioning from Gen X to millennial, I don't have a total handle on that because I am myself a millennial. So what we were doing with Gen X, I only know of through like hearing history. I started working with our mobilization team in 2006. And so at that point, we were full on targeting millennials. And what we really did at that point was we pivoted hard toward talking about, passion and really pushing authenticity. And so those things were things that we tried to highlight in everything we did, and how we talked about the mission and print materials, and how we talked about the mission in rooms in front of young people. I think that one of the challenges we have as an organization, and I do personally, is doing better mass communication over social media. I don't think those are vehicles for replacing the deep personal connection that really serves people well. But I think that is a space in which we can do a much better job. And I think across the board, organizations need to find ways to do a better job in connecting to folks in those social spheres. And, to some extent, things that like are easy for us, for me as a millennial, like Facebook, Facebook came into being like in my late college, early post-college life. The smartphone generation is less interested in Facebook than the millennials. So it's I have no idea what a good missions mobilization strategy is for Snapchat.
Yeah.
Or, I have something of an idea with Instagram, but the Snapchat, I've got no idea.
Right.
So
it's the new frontier.
The new frontier.
Great. This question just came in that I love. What aspects of the gospel would you say tend to most resonate with this generation?
Yeah. I think it's what I've seen is insisting on hopefulness in really dark places. I think about walking alongside someone in this generation who has taken the big step of acknowledging, like, whenever I'm alone for any amount of time, I just want to look at pornography. And getting to the point where somebody's telling me that, but then even pushing beyond that and insisting to them that they are, that they are not disqualified from being used by God because that's their story of brokenness. That even a major addictive sort of messy thing like that is something that they can have hope that Christ is at work within them and will work redemptively to give them the ability to care for others who have gone through the same thing. So I think that kind of hope in really isolated, dark spaces is, the gospel's big enough for that, is important.
Yeah.
And naming it, I think that's the thing that's hard, is that when you're talking about a generation that's more isolated, just naming some things like that can be really powerful. Because they may not have ever heard that or thought that something like that applied to them.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Great. Someone asked the question, it's great to help coach the next generation towards their passions, but how do we encourage them to also engage with the parts of life that they're not so passionate about, but are just as necessary? So parts of life, or even parts of ministry life, right? There's always things that we're not as passionate about. So any insight you can give into that?
Yeah. I think my immediate thought there is probably some of my older peers, even in this old an organization, might be thinking like, yeah, Matt, because they're like, as a 35-year-old, you're still a kid. And some of your life skills are not what they should be. But my other more serious thought kind of goes back to what I was saying about developmental delays. And so I think there is space, there has to be space for patience about the developmental delays that we're seeing. That, and to some extent, we don't quite know when the smartphone generation is truly going to become adults as a whole. We know that they're not adults when they're 18. We know that they're not going to be adults when they graduate college. And we're not sure when they will become adults. And so, there's work to be done alongside these folks to help build resiliency in this like attenuated childhood / adolescence. But there also needs to be patience for, responsibility, life skills, good communication habits, organization, those things that just come with you being an adult who recognizes that you're responsible for your life and you have to do things to, as part of that responsibility, that still is going to be slow on average. because of these, macro level factors.
Yeah.
If you didn't get a driver's license until you were 20, knowing how to be a tractor trailer driver at 22 is probably unrealistic. It's there's like this attenuation that you have to take into consideration.
Yeah.
So
great. Since I believe we have a good number of boomers on our call, and they also supervise millennials.
Yeah.
One of our supervisors at Serge has asked, what advice would you give boomers who supervise millennials? And I know millennials aren't the main focus, but as a millennial, I wonder if you could speak to that for the people listening who are interested in that.
No, that's a great question. So, some of the sociologists and psychologists who study these generational questions talk about millennials as like an echo of boomers. So most millennials are the children of boomers. And so there are I think there's actually more similarities between millennials and boomers than maybe some boomers see. I think probably in leadership of millennials, both generations share a certain individualism and a certain ambition that does line up well. I think the big disjunction is that millennials as a generation tend to be suspicious of authority. And they share that with boomers, but the downside is boomers don't recognize that they're the man as much as they should. And millennials are naive in thinking that that boomers are somehow any different from anybody else. They're sort of otherizing them as authorities. So what I think that boomers can do that's really helpful is lean into millennial respect for authenticity. Millennials are hungry for authentic relationship and authentic interactions. And so I think that part of boomer authenticity is to recognize that they're the man, even though they themselves, when they were young, were, preaching against the man. They are now the man. And to relate to millennials with a humility of knowing I'm the man now, but I'm with you, and I genuinely value you, and your individuality and your ambition and your capacity to contribute. And so, I think that on a generation to generation level, I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's great. You guys have so many good questions here. I can tell this is something you engage with a lot. One of our workers on the field just asked, what advice would you give millennials who supervise boomers? But that might have to wait for another webinar.
Yeah, that's a great question.
I have a couple questions here, and these are probably our last couple of questions. I'm going to combine them a little bit, but It's on the topic of, as an older generation, how do we really build relationships with this generation? So one person asked, do you see a desire among the smartphone generation to share life and experiences with older people? Or does their hesitancy about relationships, even with peers, manifest itself even more so in a reluctance to be with older people, especially boomers? Do you have any advice on how to grow relationships, deepen trust? And then we also had someone ask, do I need to have a Twitter account or Snapchat or use social media all the time to help pastor these folks well? So kind of related there.
Those are great questions. I'm terrified of social media, because of how addictive it is. So to your first question, I don't know. I mean, I don't have the maturity to keep, I have an Instagram account, but I don't have it on my phone because I don't have the maturity to use it well, to not just zone out scrolling through other people's lives. So as a pastor, there's a certain discernment question of can I get into this potentially really dark world of social media for the sake of the other, or will it just become my own self-indulgence? And I'm not good enough to really be in there in a good way. the other question is really interesting. The one about, how do we relate to the smartphone generation? Is there any hunger for a relationship with us? I think that's a great question. A couple anecdotes I've read in preparing for this webinar have sort of highlighted the way in which the smartphone generation's parents are functioning kind of like heavy nurturers throughout their whole childhood and attenuated childhood and adolescence. So I go to the mall as a smartphone generation person, but my mom always brings me, and my mom's always there even though I'm not interacting with her. Or I don't have a driver's license because my dad just drives me everywhere. And so I think I think that if you're of the same generation as a smartphone gen's parents, like if you're a boomer or older Gen Xer, there is a major barrier to authentic relationship because there's a predisposition to see you as a parent figure in this like service heavy way, like feed me, wash me, clothe me, drive me. And I think I honestly don't have a good answer for how to get around that. I know it's worked for me. I think it's worth trying to be sort of vulnerable and authentic and lead with that. I honestly don't know if that would then destabilize the kind of parent-child dynamic that may be the default. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Matt. Thanks for answering these questions. And thanks to all of you for asking such great questions. These have been really helpful. Matt, do you have any closing comments? Anything you'd like to wrap up with?
I think that I appreciate you guys listening and asking these questions. Feel free to email me if you have other things that you want to talk about. I'm happy to have, phone, Skype conversations. I don't know very much more about this stuff than what I've already shared with you, but I'm happy to have discussions anyway. We can learn together. I think that it's important for all of us to look at this generation with empathy and not cynicism or anxiety. I think that the cynicism and anxiety are the two things that I am most prone towards them. To just sort of shake my head at and see their isolated, smartphone-driven, sedentary lives with scorn, and then to feel anxious about like, what does this mean for the future of the church, of ministries, of American society, of world civilization. And I don't think either cynicism or anxiety is a faith-filled response. I think empathy and understanding and faith that Jesus has as much to offer an 18-year-old as he does an 80-year-old or a 35-year-old or a 55-year-old. And so I think it's up to us to move towards this generation with that faith.
Yeah, amen. That's great. Great. Well, thank you, Matt. As we finish up today, I just want to remind you of a couple of resources that might be helpful for you as you engage with what faith working itself through love looks like. And our mentored sonship program is what we actually use with our apprentices and interns on the field. We also love mentoring ministry leaders through it from all organizations or ministry contexts. And our discipler training curriculum, a lot of our apprenticeship staff actually go through this course as a way to help equip them with tools for mentoring and discipling the next generation. So if that's something that's part of your work or ministry, I'd encourage you to check that out. Matt also spoke a bit about our summer internships and our apprenticeship programs. Both of those are fully explained on our website, www.serge.org. So I've engaged in both of these in different ways, and I would really recommend you checking them out or passing the info along to young people that you lead. And one more thing is just that you're going to get all of this in an email tomorrow, so don't worry about jotting it down. We'll have links to all of these programs and curriculum resources. You'll also be receiving a link to a video recording of the webinar, and please feel free to pass that on to whoever you think might find it helpful in their ministry context. Our next webinar is going to take place in mid-July, and it will be on the topic of avoiding burnout in ministry. So just in time for summer and hopefully some Sabbath rest for all of you. So you can watch Serge's website and social media for info about registration. That'll be coming soon. And finally, if you would like to learn more about Serge, you can always visit us at serge.org. To see the places that we serve around the world and other resources we can help equip you with. So it's been a gift to be with you all today, and thanks again, Matt, for joining us.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.